I'm Hans Lysglimt. You're watching the Freedom Academy. I want to say a couple of words about Europe and Europe as opposed to the US. And as you know, I'm a Norwegian. I'm in Norway, Oslo, Norway, working for the Ron Paul campaign in the US. And people have been asking me why I do that, and my answer to that is that the Ron Paul campaign is really about global issues, really about freedom for mankind. At least that's my perspective on it. Other people can have other perspectives, that it's merely a US related issue and that it's about US politics. But from my perspective as a Norwegian, the US government is the biggest, strongest, largest government ever in humankind. Its tentacles are everywhere and its army is everywhere. So what happens in America is relevant for everyone in the whole world. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't. I wish the Ron Paul campaign and freedom and liberty and what happens in the US was merely a domestic US issue. That would be great, but it's not. It's something that concerns everyone, and that's why I am involved myself. And also because the ideas that Ron Paul are talking about, the underlying ideas, they're not about Ron Paul, they're not about America, they're not about the United States, they're about humankind, they're about freedom, they're about liberty. And these are things that are eternal and global and concerns everyone. That's why I'm in this thing. Now, let's talk about Europe. That's where we started out. And Europe is important to the Ron Paul campaign in the sense that America today, and America is how it was created, is the best example of a free society that has ever existed in the world. Its foundation, its basis is the best that has ever been. But what it has become is very different. It's not really a society of freedom today because the federal government has become so big that really we need a revolution to bring it back to where it should be. But the ideas are still there. But it's important to realize that the intellectual framework and the ideas originated in Europe, and they were made into fruition in the US. They blossomed in the US, and the US created this fantastic constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. But the ideas were really taken from Europe. And some of these ideas and the traditions, they still live on in Europe. In Europe, we don't have any one country that really is an example of liberty as we have in the US. But what we have in Europe is a number of countries where different kind of traditions have lived on. And the traditions of the French Revolution, they still live on in France in different forms. The traditions of the English Revolution still live on there. And the Roman Empire still has some tentacles out there. For my part, living in Scandinavia, we still have some of the Norse roots in us, in our laws, in our attitudes, in how we think, in our language. And that's really what's important about Europe, is that there are diversity. There's a couple of dozen countries that each have their own traditions, and they've had their own revolutions, and they have their own laws. And this plurality of ideas, of traditions, of schools and universities is really what makes Europe interesting and strong and important still. Because a lot of the ideas of liberty as individual pieces are actually alive today, even stronger in parts of Europe than they are in the US. And the fact that you have this plurality of ideas and traditions in schools means that a lot of things live on in a different way than they do in the US. The US, especially when it comes to the federal government, has become very monotonous. It's one thing. It's one federal government. It's one law. The states still have pro forma their independence and their separate ways. But the federal government is so big, it's everywhere. And things like the IRS, the FBI, it's so federal and so strong on the federal level that it has become sort of like a one-way school of thought, a one-way direction. And even though you have a tremendous plurality in America of people and traditions living under that umbrella, you have one judicial system overall, one umbrella. And in Europe, you have many. And for a lover of freedom and liberty, many is always better than one. Because when you have choice and many different, you will have different ways of picking and choosing and having ideas living on in one place and maybe dying off in another. And the plurality that still exists in Europe is a huge and important part of liberty in the world. And if liberty is going to come back and prevail, Europe is important because of the idea traditions that are in Europe. We don't have that in Asia, it's totally different. But in Europe, we have a tradition in Sweden, we have another in England, another in France, another in Norway, and so on. And it's important to keep these going. And this is also why I'm very skeptical, I'm very negative to the European Union. The European Union is an effort to make a federal government like the US in Europe, where one government, one umbrella will encompass everything and direct everything into a one-way line of thinking, and really killing off a lot of the plurality and different laws that are in Europe. So one day after 2008, someday in the future, I'm going to ask you to help out in Europe, because we're going to need to fight the federal government in Europe as much as we need to fight the federal government in the United States eventually. But that fight is not now. In 2008, the fight is in the US, it's the Ron Paul campaign, and getting the message out there as much as possible. But we will know when the fight will come in Europe. Maybe it's when they try to come up with that constitution for the European Union again, or maybe it's when the euro collapses, or sometime. We don't know that yet. Maybe it'll be next year, or maybe 10 years or 20 years from now. But I will call on you, and I hope you will remember that the EU is as bad as the federal government in the US. And when the day comes, I hope that you will support our efforts in Europe to keep Europe free. So that's a story about Europe as compared to the United States, and how Europe is relevant to the Ron Paul campaign in 2008. I'm Hans Lysglimt. You're watching the Freedom Academy. The Freedom Academy would not be possible without my sponsor, runbox.com. Runbox email and web hosting. Get your email out of the US, get your email out of the US government's reach. I suggest you get your email to Norway, to Runbox. You're watching Freedom Academy.